Picture this, it's the early 2000s and you're at a gas station somewhere near Newark, New Jersey, and an overweight, chain-smoking Dan Hurley gets out of his wife's beater car, which is a maroon RAV4 that had the nice touch of a pink and turquoise logo on the back, and he approaches you asking for $10 or whatever you can spare to help pay his gas bill. He's so broke, more than that, he's 6 figures in debt, that he has no other way to pay, and he's misplaced his $10 that he had in the visor, likely story pal, and he is asking you and everyone else at the gas station to give him a couple bucks to help him pay for his tank of gas. At home around this time, his wife's meeting with a divorce attorney, unbeknownst to him, to see if she can divorce the guy because he's been such a wreck and a bad partner. But she's told they're too poor to get a divorce. They can't afford it. Give it 6 more months, the divorce attorney tells her. He's got a toddler boy at home, his son Danny, and a newborn son Andrew that he's sort of MIA with. He's not helping with diapers and middle of the night stuff. His high school basketball team that he's coaching is good, but not great. They're 22-7. But for him, growing up in the shadow of perhaps the greatest high school coach of all time, he doesn't think that's very good. So after taking in that scene, would you believe it if someone told you that about 20 years down the road, that same guy that was asking all these people for a couple bucks to help him put $10 of gas in his car would have just won his second national championship as the head coach of a premier college basketball program, Uconn, back-to-back championships no less, and be pulling down $7 million a year, and also have a great and thriving relationship with that same wife and kids? Is life funny? Yes, it is. Has Dan Hurley's life been that volatile? Yes, it has. But God bless this man for sharing all this in his book that just came out. The book is Never Stop, Life, Leadership, and What It Takes to Be Great by Dan Hurley and Ian O'Connor. And Hurley is incredibly candid about so many things in this. His upbringing, his battles with depression and anxiety, his marriage, the shadow of his dad and brother, his neurotic ways, and the complicated but damn earnest man that he is. I think a lot of people may find Hurley to be erratic or a jerk due to how he manages games or his New Jersey persona or his on-court or public persona, but I think they'd have it wrong. His players love him and those around him love him. And it's because he loves them first. He plays all out for his players and family, and he wants them to be successful whole people, not just successful basketball players. For me, this book was both slightly triggering and therapeutic to read about. I realized reading this that Dan Hurley and I, perhaps unfortunately, are kindred dark Irish brothers with some of the stuff we've been afflicted with, especially in our earlier years, battling anxiety and depression and fumbling athletic potential because of it, and not knowing where to turn and growing up in eras that it wasn't talked about or it was just seen as weakness and flaws, and his family dynamic and his Catholic upbringing and his marriage and his identification as a late bloomer. These things all struck an eerily familiar chord with me, some of which I'll share in this episode, but my guess is I won't be the only one. I'm sure many of you are nodding your head to some of those traits as well, and that's what I think is so beautiful about this book. Hurley squares up to anxiety and depression and to battling mental health and to all his stumbles and pitfalls and moments of being less than a man he wants to be. He squares up to all of that like a man with his shoulders back, and he doesn't sugarcoat anything. And he's taken all that struggle and that pain that he's gone through and is really trying to turn it into an altruistic force for good that helps others at this juncture in his life. At the end of the book, he talks about all of his struggles and how he shares them any chance he gets in hopes it will help someone else out. That's the idea anyway, he says. That's what makes it all worthwhile. He says in the final chapter, I wouldn't be half the coach I want to be if I didn't speak freely and frequently about my struggles with my own mental health. The hope is that my players see me being real, telling my story, and feeling zero shame about whatever they're going through. He also goes on, my agent asked me if I really wanted to be this honest publicly. I told him why not. Are you trying to get me some big endorsement deal with Gatorade? Hey, stressed people drink Gatorade too. There are people who need to hear this stuff, and that's all I care about. I think you'll be surprised at what you find out about Dan Hurley in this episode. If you're a Uconn fan or a fan of his dad or his brothers or from New Jersey, you probably already love this guy. If not, you may still love him, or you may have a negative opinion about him from the clips you've seen or his coaching. This is a flawed guy, and he definitely wears it on his sleeve. But I think you'll find if you look past some of those sideline tantrums, he develops kids in an elite way. He treats the whole person, he wants to help others learn from his battles, and he does all of that with a ton of success. For the record, and to state the obvious, I'm not a mental health professional. I'm just a guy giving my takes and sharing my experiences here. So what I'm giving isn't mental health advice. I only offer it as a fellow human, not a mental health professional. Please, please, please seek out mental health help if you need it. As Dan Hurley and I will share in here, there's no shame in that. Shame shouldn't even be a word involved here. It's courageous as hell. I encourage you to go do it. Let's dive deeper on the enigma of a man that is Dan Hurley. This is the Coach's Podcast. Okay, let's talk about Coach Hurley's background in his early life. And his background is important as it is for all these coaches. As you may have heard me say on every podcast I've done, I love studying these parts of great coaches, their early life, the people whose shoulders they stand on. There's so much to glean, to reverse engineer, and to put to work in our own lives. But for Dan Hurley in particular, his was very unique because it wasn't like his parents were Bill and Karen in the Chicago suburbs. His dad was Dan Hurley Sr., probably the greatest high school coach of all time. and his older brother Bobby ended up being one of the most iconic and greatest college basketball players of all time at Duke. So pressure and expectation are around Dan in spades growing up, and this is really tough for a kid prone to anxiety and to catastrophizing like Dan Hurley is and was. But let's start with his dad, who I don't want to say is a complex figure for him. He never says that in the book, but to me, reading between the lines, there's probably an element of that there. His dad is what you'd call old school, tough, intense, feared, not showing a lot of emotion. He was the type of guy that showed his love by working the heck out of you, and that was his way of keeping you safe. That's about as close to the warm and fuzzies as you'd get from Bob Hurley Sr. But like a lot of guys of his ilk, there's a softie somewhere in there deep down, and service and love, although it wasn't how Bob Sr. presented himself on the surface necessarily, were absolutely there, and I think central to who he was. And this probably goes all the way back to how Bob Sr. himself was raised. Dan says in the book, he was the son of a Jersey nurse and a police officer, Eleanor and Bob. So I guess you could say he had both healer and enforcer genes. And then Dan goes on to also say about his dad, he was a fan of John F. Kennedy, and Dad dreamed when he was our age of joining Kennedy's Peace Corps. He even thought about becoming a priest. He had that sense of mission, of service. He made a few $1,000s a year, but he turned that school into something elite, something 60 Minutes would ultimately call the Juilliard of high school basketball. And again, to be clear, their dad was an out-of-this-world coach. Dan thinks he would have won national championships just like him had he gone to the college level. Instead, he stayed at the high school level in Jersey City, and this is probably, again, due to the loyalty to that town, to that service bone that he had, and that desire to be a Peace Corps guy or a priest deep down. And he took that basketball program, St. Anthony's, to unbelievable places, not just locally but nationally, and he became the best of the best. His record at St. Anthony's was 1,185 wins to 125 losses, so that's pretty much winning 90% of the time. 28 state titles, 4 national championships at the high school level, and at one point they won 9 consecutive state titles. He's one of only 3 high school coaches that are in the Naismith Hall of Fame, so you really have to stand out to do that. A GOAT high school coach, to be sure. And Dan, not surprisingly, is a lot like his dad. Certainly different in some ways. His dad and his brother, Bob Sr. and Bob Jr., had this crazy fortitude and extreme toughness that Dan acknowledges in here. He just didn't have to that degree that they had it. But Dan was much more gregarious, and he had a quick wit and a sense of humor, and almost had this artistic side to him. But as far as being a great coach and a leader and a molder of men, Dan probably got a lot of that from his dad by nature and by nurture, from just being around him and raised by him. Jersey City, where they grew up, is also huge to his dad, as it is to Dan and his brother and the whole family as well. It says in the book, despite the ambition that Mom instilled in my dad or brought out in him, they were never ever leaving Jersey City. It wasn't even a thought. They had no interest in joining the mass exodus to the suburbs and buying some lovely Dutch colonial with an acre of emerald grass and a sweet little garage and neighbors who wear pink and green tennis outfits. It didn't matter to them that the urban decline had decimated Jersey City, vanishing the thousands of manufacturing jobs. My parents were Jersey City through and through, and their motto, their whole aura, was simple. We're not going anywhere. So like I said, Jersey City is practically a character in this book and in Hurley's life. Dan Hurley himself says something to that effect, that he's not complicated. You just need to roll out a map of Jersey City and New Jersey and you'll know who he is. That's how much he identifies with the vibe and the culture there, even to the point where among the first things he yells into the crowd after his 2 NCAA national championships recently at Uconn were, Jersey City, Jersey City. So yeah, very top of mind for this guy. In fact, crazy side story, he pretty much credits it as a reason he turns down the Laker job. And this is just recently, in June of 2024. He had an opportunity to become the coach of the LA Lakers. They ultimately hired J.J. Redick after Coach Hurley declined. But he and his wife and his family, they were all set to go. The Lakers wined and dined him incredibly. His wife hit it off with some East Coast connections with someone in the Lakers organization. And they had resolved to make that change for their family, and Coach Hurley was going to go be the Lakers coach. But then they went back home to soak all of this in. They had a Billy Joel concert on the books at Madison Square Garden, so they went to that. And on the way out of that concert, he has this chance encounter with an old Jersey City neighbor that made this huge impression on him and made him realize he wasn't an LA guy. And he cites that encounter as one of the main reasons he turns down the Laker job, because of Jersey City loyalty in a way. It's a great moment right at the beginning of the book, but he says he felt this tap on his shoulder and he had a hard time placing the face. But then he says, Courtney Lynch from Jersey City, get the hell out of here, Courtney Lynch. I haven't seen you forever, he says. And they had a great time reminiscing about the old neighborhood and the old times. But then he goes on to say, I turned to go, but she held on for an extra second. Danny, she said, you're from Jersey City. You can't go to Los Angeles. I looked at her, sort of shocked. I didn't know what to say, but my face must have asked the question why. She grinned and looked deep into my eyes, deep, really deep, seeing me the only way someone from Jersey City can ever really see me. And she said the one thing that only someone from Jersey City could say to me. You ain't Hollywood, bro. Ha, that's good, so good. And yes, shows how hardcore he and his parents and everyone he knew from Jersey City were or are about where they come from. But back to his dad, Bob Sr. So like I said, his dad was tough, but a lot of that came from what was going on around him and in the rough and tumble streets of Jersey City. His dad was a parole officer as his day job, so he wasn't just a coach, he had a day job. And yeah, being a parole officer will jade you. And he saw all these kids with idle time getting into drugs and crime, and they got AIDS and all sorts of scary stuff as a parent. And Dan says of this element, Dad's intensity was rooted in love. He knew what happened to Jersey City kids who were not raised in a disciplined household. He did not want that happening to us. As a probation officer, my father saw firsthand that idleness was the devil's golden opportunity. He constantly saw neighborhood kids turning to heroin, dying of AIDS. He saw young boys switch overnight from a can of beer to a needle in the arm. Their lives instantly ruined. It scared him. And so Bob Sr. ran his kids and his family tight. He literally ran Bob and Dan as well around town to keep them busy. And this is one of the things that gave the Hurley boys great physical stamina and endurance. And so to me, all of this from Bob Sr. is that very male way of can't say it with my words or show it with my actions or soft actions or nurturing, but I'm going to protect you by being a hard ass. And to that end of things, I love what Dan Hurley says about his dad's rules, which highlights a good coaching principle that's in Lou Holtz's book as well. A lot of coaches would say this is don't have too many rules. You want to be able to enforce them. If you have too many rules, you can't really do that, and keep them simple and allow some freedom in there to determine consequences. But this Hurley rule is great, and it's just one rule. And Dan Hurley says of this rule of his dad's, the rule was very, very simple, and I can't remember a time when I didn't know it or couldn't recite it on the spot. Embarrass the Hurley name by being an F-up meant built to the ass. So there you go, one rule that will cover about 99.5% of behavior. Direct, straightforward, unambiguous, and it sounded like it worked quite well to keep the Hurley boys moving upward and onward. So his dad was stern, no doubt. It didn't sound like a guy they could get super close to, but they did have some great extended family around, and this is the beautiful thing about extended family. They can really fill in some of these gaps that might be present in your relationship with your parents. And there's a little more freedom in there in those relationships because you just don't have that pressure of the father-son or the parent-child relationship. I know I benefited from this immensely with some of my Chicago family on my dad's side and my Montana family on my mom's. Lou Holtz had this in East Liverpool, Ohio growing up. Joe Madden, the baseball manager, talks about something similar in Hazleton, Pennsylvania with his extended family there. And the Hurley boys had this too. It says, my brother and I were always together. We ran away from home a few times. We wanted to escape the Hurley standards. Sometimes we found refuge at our Uncle Jackie's. He was a warm, funny, chill guy. Once we went straight to my grandmother's house on Danforth Avenue. We sat with Dad's siblings, Uncle Brian, Uncle Timmy, and Aunt Sheila, telling them our stories. Dad was the oldest. He'd been the same since he was a boy, so they already knew. They sympathized. Uncle Brian made us cheesecakes and then sent us home. So that extended family, that can be like manna from the heavens at the right time. And it's a really awesome thing and an important thing to have that village or extended family close to you or accessible to you because you get those different perspectives. You get that safer place. It can help you understand your own parents a little better and to also just get those valuable alternative insights and perspectives from other families or other people's modeling. Let's talk about his dad more specifically as a coach. Again, toughness was his main thing, and certainly Dan and Bobby felt this as his sons, but Dan says they weren't the only ones who were intimidated by him. He says in the book, we were intimidated by my father, but I guess it was a revelation to see so many other kids felt the same way too. Dad would simultaneously scare you and make you want to fight him, but if you did fight him, you knew you had to kill him, or else he'd kick the S word out of you. So again, Bob Hurley Sr. ruled with an iron fist and was one of those guys who was probably a darn pit bull if you crossed him. It's funny, later in the book when Dan Hurley's coaching at Uconn, and they have a lot of tough games with Creighton in the Big East, the Omaha World Herald, the paper in Omaha, where Creighton is, had a title of an article about him that he was college basketball's biggest villain. He had a lot of sideline antics and colorful behavior, we'll say, in a lot of those Creighton games that led them to write that. But Dan Hurley found this funny in relation to how his dad was. He says, my dad was a way bigger monster on the sidelines than I am, and he was revered. The man achieved godlike status, and he didn't yell or chirp at fans one less bit than his youngest son. Someone much smarter than me needs to explain why I'm evil and Dad's face is on the coaching Mount Rushmore. You know, a lot of that probably has to do with society and the proliferation of media and how in his dad's day, those things were more socially and societally acceptable, and there wasn't social media, and not every person was armed with a cell phone. It kind of reminds me of Michael Jordan versus Tiger Woods. If Michael Jordan had transgressions back in the day, they weren't as well documented by the media or citizen reporters, if you will, with their cell phones. But as Tiger Woods came about, there was just more scrutiny on him. There was more proliferation of media. The engagement with media became different, and so things were a lot more different for Tiger Woods than they would for Michael Jordan. And some of that media progression probably parallels how Bob Sr. was seen back in the day versus how Dan Hurley is portrayed or seen today. And I've thought about this as well as to whether there's genius or if that's admirable to behave in this loudmouth, occasionally referee or fan-shaming type of way. And I don't know if admirable is the right word, but I do think there's some genius there as a coach. There's some air cover, and there's some things this does for your players that aren't immediately obvious at face value, but are definitely there and that help free up players in some way. Now, I think if that sort of thing gets out of hand to the point where you're doing that to your players or shaming them or harming their sense of self-worth, or if you're crossing the line with fans, no, I don't think that's great. I think that's negative coaching or behavior, and that's terrible. But as far as these guys that get animated with media or referees, sometimes the players like it because it gives them air cover. It takes the pressure and the stress and attention off of them. Earl Weaver was this way with the Orioles, right? He was almost a vaudeville act in his long tenure with the Orioles, but there was a certain genius to that. And Bill Belichick, how he mumbled his way through the media and had a lot of attention on him in that way. It just gives your players some freedom, and they often enjoy that air cover. As long as you're good to them, it's not as bad as it looks at face value, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make. And I would reference the Bible on this as well. I think the Bible gives us some phenomenal instruction on this in real life, but in the context of what Jesus says about spotting false prophets. He says, "You'll know the false prophets by their fruits. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit." That's from Matthew 7:15-20. But what he's saying there, that to me just applies to real life as well, is don't follow the rhetoric too closely, but watch what it produces. The rhetoric can be really severe at times, like it can with guys like Coach Hurley or his dad, or it can be really seducing at times, like it can with a false prophet. The point being, don't take the rhetoric or the shocking things some people say at face value, or conversely, don't always take the super polished, convincing, seducing things people say at face value. Look at the fruits, look at the outcomes and the actions. Back to his dad as a coach, I want to talk about how great he was, but also the context of that greatness. St. Anthony's was poor as heck and had very little or no facilities and resources. Dan says in the book, St. Anthony's was financially strapped. Housed in a simple brick building run by a couple Felicia nuns, Sister Ellen and Sister Felicia, it didn't even have a gym to call its own. In no world should the St. Anthony's friars have been dominant, and yet the singular force of my father's will and my brother's otherworldly talent made it so. And he goes on to say, not only did St. Anthony's win, they beat up on much larger schools. They played a formidable national schedule and broke down top-ranked teams mostly through relentless defensive pressure. The Friars were also known for their excellent fundamentals, developed under duress by Dad during his patented Navy SEAL Hell Week practices. Those must have been fun. Usually held at a local event space called White Eagle Hall. White Eagle Hall, I love this. I want to visit this place. It reminds me of the school gym of the middle school where I went in southeast Portland. It was called St. Ignatius, also run by nuns. It wasn't even a hardwood floor. It had a VCT tile floor in it. Basically, that's the flooring that goes in classrooms and hallways in the school. And that's what they had as the gym floor. And they had bingo nights and Italian dinner nights. And it was usually kind of a dusty floor. Definitely didn't have glass backboards. But compared to White Eagle Hall, my St. Ignatius gym sounded like it was the Ritz. Listen to how Hurley describes White Eagle Hall. White Eagle Hall, and I say this with love, was a true you-know-what hole. But even so, you could make the argument it was the real success of St. Anthony's, since White Eagle Hall mostly hosted bingo games and christenings and polka dances and wedding receptions. Before every practice, we needed to break down 50 or 60 tables and stow away a couple hundred folding chairs and gather up empty cups and bottles and sweep up cigarette butts. Then, at last, we could take the court. Meanwhile, as we started putting up our first shots, the last tipsy stragglers from the christening or the dance would be tottering out onto busy Newark Avenue. Hurley goes on to say, White Eagle Hall was where I learned to make the best of an extremely bad situation. Every day in that joint was like a USC fight. The roof leaked, the floor sloped, and the walls were right on top of you. The whole experience of not having a real gym, of having to do janitorial work before practice, of being mentally and physically exhausted from battling the facilities as well as the opponent, the feeling of pouring yourself into Dad's van or onto the number 9 bus. For me, it was the TriMet 75 bus in Portland that my brother and I took. Hurley says, that was all part of the training. So what a coaching lesson. This reminds me of John Wooden's stories about the B.O. Barn, which is a multi-use facility he had to practice in his early days at UCLA. Coach Wooden had to constantly sweep the floor and share the space with other students and teams. Vivian Stringer, the great women's basketball coach, she started out at Cheney State. They had zero resources. I mean, that school had nothing for the women's basketball program. And no one willingly signs up for that, but there's a gift in that. It so often sets the table for greatness. If you meet that challenge in the right way, you get this fortitude and this resolve that can really create some greatness and pay some real dividends. So in the end, while their dad was super tough, both Dan and his brother were insightful enough to know that there was a lot of love from their dad. They respected the heck out of him. And while his intimidator persona was the majority of their dad's persona, Dan also shares in the book, quoting here, that's just how he was. And I can't remember a time when Bob and I didn't know that's how it was. We never went looking for more hugs and kisses, but we were grateful for his attention. That in and of itself was a rare gift, and especially in the neighborhoods where we come from. Let's go play stickball, Dad would say. Hey, let's go throw the football around. We didn't see other dads spending that kind of hyper-focused time with their kids. So I think that's beautiful. Back to the looking at the fruits of things, those are great fruits from Bob Sr. the intentional, hyper-focused time he spent with the boys, the foundation of discipline and toughness that he gave them to go out and be successful in the world, were some of the real fruits that Bob Hurley Sr. instilled in his boys. Let's move on to talk about Bobby Hurley. As I mentioned, an iconic player at Duke in the early 90s. Dan calls him Bob a lot in this book, but to most of the world, he was known as Bobby Hurley. It's been quite a while now, but he was a huge star at Duke in the early 90s along Christian Laettner. They won back-to-back national championships under Coach K. They defeated what seemed like an unbeatable UNLV team with Larry Johnson and Stacey Augmon and all those guys. And then Bobby got drafted into the pros to the Sacramento Kings and probably would have been a great pro as well, but his career got cut short by an auto accident. Leaving the Arco Arena one day, his forerunner got T-boned, and he was lucky to be alive, but he was never quite the same player after that. But these brothers, Dan and Bobby, were best friends, and they shared a room in the basement in their modest house in Jersey City, and they were just kind of boys being boys. It also says these guys were small and late bloomers. You know, everybody would comment to Bob Hurley Sr. about his boys being great at basketball, and then they'd say, how tall are they or how old are they? Because they were these shrimpy dudes and were sort of late bloomers. And again, same for me and my brothers, and especially my little brother. He was the guy who had to stand on one of those plyometric box jumps for his freshman year homecoming picture just to be the size of his date. I mean, the dude looked like he was about 8 years old as a freshman. Dan and Bob's childhood was very familiar, very Catholic. They went to Catholic schools. Dan says, we shared a group of buddies all equally sports crazed. Our small driveway was a field of dreams for wiffle ball. It was the Hurley boys versus the Savino brothers over and over again. Very familiar to me, as it would be for millions of young boys growing up in the good old USA. But like I said, Dan's relationship with Bobby is great. They're brothers first and foremost, and they love each other, and they have each other's back. And they always have and will, it sounds like. But there's always that wrinkle, and especially when they were growing up, that Bob cast a big shadow because he was older and because all the hype and success he had as a player. That was tough for Dan to live under and to live up to, and especially with Dan's more sensitive, anxiety-prone personality. And I want to hit on that personality thing for a minute because I think it's a key learning here. It's obvious to say that people have different personalities and pain thresholds and levels of sensitivity and creativity, empathy, gregariousness, etc. Everybody has a different compilation of those things that make up their personality. But when those differences happen amongst siblings, and because of all the comparing going on when you're siblings, that can make it really difficult for one sibling or another, especially at this stage of their lives for Dan Hurley, and maybe even later for Bobby, because Dan's had so much success as a coach. It can be really difficult, depending on the circumstances of how those personality traits are fitting into life for one sibling or the other, because people are always going to compare you. That's just human nature, fair or unfair. But Dan, in his words, says, we were different players. We were also different people. Bob was quiet, serious. I was a free spirit, a cut-up, the jokester in every room. I like to disrupt stuff. He uses the other S word there, but you know what I mean. And he also says earlier, Bob was born with some strain of grit and inner fortitude that I just didn't have. He stood up to my father, thrived under the old man's punishing regimens. I couldn't handle it in the same way, and I knew it, and what's more, my dad and Bob knew it. I think that's key, and I love Dan Hurley for sharing this. In reading the book, it's clear that Dan almost has more of what some would call an artist sensitivity. I think it's a big part of what makes him an elite coach. He has incredible empathy and people reading skills and can understand the mental, emotional side of people and the game at probably a higher level in that capacity than his dad and his brother. And there's another side of the coin to both of those personality types. But when Danny doesn't have as much of what people love about his dad or his brother, that's very hard for him growing up and for his personality type being very prone to anxiety and depression, as we'll get into in a minute. Sometimes that tendency toward anxiety and depression is just the cost of doing business for having a keen emotional intelligence like Dan has. And his dad and his brother didn't have as much of that. They probably indexed further away from the emotional end than Dan was. Hence, their strengths were a higher threshold for pain and mental pain and fortitude. While again, Dan's was emotional intelligence and personality and quick wit. All great strengths, all have their flip side. But the point is, when you're odd man out, like Dan was in some respects at this stage, that can be tough. Dan's moments and eras where his gifts were more of a fit and things aligned for them to shine come later in his coaching days. Again, he's a late bloomer. All that wit, people reading skills, and emotional intelligence, they came up huge as he started his coaching career. And obviously now he's a two-time national champion and an incredible coach. But as a teenager, young adult, not having success in the same way that his dad and his brother were having and not being quite the way they were a heck of a thing for a sensitive, bright young kid to contend with. So let's talk about that. As I said in the intro, and as is a big theme in this book, he's very candid about his battles with anxiety and depression and mental wellness. I think that's most of the book, which is awesome. And I think a lot of what sets this up in his life, this intense anxiety and depression that Hurley has, is in large part life getting out of balance. He grew up and it was just basketball, 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 and an intense father who drilled him on this stuff, and that was worried about him getting into trouble, so he pressed even harder. So it was just basketball and basketball and running and maybe some more basketball. And again, his brother and his dad might have relished that more because they kind of had this, I love the taste of blood, fortitude, and capacity for difficult, intense singularity like that. But Dan probably needed a little more diversity in his life, a little more balance. And I think that's proved out at his time at Seton Hall, which we'll get into. But for Dan, just trying to keep up with his dad and his brother in this way is redlining the heck out of him. It's just not him to the degree that it was them. And to be clear, Dan was a phenomenal high school basketball player. They won state titles his junior and senior season. He was the best player in the state his senior year. Even his dad ran a bunch of plays for him, more than he said he ever did for his brother Bobby, and his dad paid him a huge compliment. He said that Dan had the best offensive season of any St. Anthony's player in his 45 years as a coach. And Dan says some of the comments like that took the sting out of the Bob comparisons that he was experiencing, but he was still under that big shadow and would get the "you ain't as good as your brother" shouts and heckles from people. But on the topic of burnout, Dan goes on to say, on the night of my St. Anthony's graduation, I celebrated with a couple buddies by driving them around in my old brown and tan Nissan Maxima. It had 132,000 miles on it, and I felt like I had twice that many miles on me. So he's already exhausted as a teenager, as an 18-year-old. And as Vince Lombardi would say, fatigue makes cowards of us all. And I would add, that doesn't exactly set you up for good mental health. So Dan probably wants a break, but he's a great player, and he's getting recruited by some great D1 schools. So the pace doesn't really let up. He says, Seton Hall and Rutgers were among the best Division I teams that recruited me. And he says, I wanted to attend Rutgers partly because there wouldn't be as much pressure. So already here he's signaling for help in a way, but he says his parents were against it. He'd known PJ Carlesimo, the coach of Seton Hall at the time, his whole life, and he loved him. And so he ends up going that route to Seton Hall. And then another sort of signal or cry for help or survival instinct that he exhibits here is he begs to live in the freshman dorms at Seton Hall. This is highly unusual for a basketball player. No freshman had ever done that before at Seton Hall. This is just because, in my opinion, he wants to have more of a normal life, wants to see what life is like outside of this intense vacuum of basketball that he's been in. And that wish was granted. He gets to live there, and this is maybe for the worst, or maybe it was one of those things that was for the best ultimately, because living there starts this process that he has to rock bottom that's going to require him to make some big changes down the road, but it's not going to be for a couple of years. He says of his freshman year, I went nuts on my own. For the first time in my life, I let it all hang out. I was immature, rebellious, high as a kite on my newfound freedom. I started drinking heavily. I didn't smoke weed, but I made up for it with loads of Coors Light, washed down with gallons of Jägermeister and tequila and Hennessy and 40s of malt liquor. So at one point, he hotwires a golf cart amongst other trouble he was causing and gets kicked off campus and out of the dorms. But his mom helps him get an apartment off campus, but that doesn't really stop the drinking and the partying. He keeps it up. And somehow he's still participating in big-time Division I basketball. During all this, he says, the night before a big game against Ohio State on CBS, I was passed out on the side of I-280. I stumbled home at 2 a.m. and then stumbled into the 8 a.m. shoot-around reeking of booze. The tip-off was set for noon on Super Bowl Sunday. Of this time, Hurley says of himself, a clinical diagnosis would surely have employed the phrase self-sabotage. The patient didn't want to know definitively if he was good enough to compete at the highest level. Good enough to help Seton Hall do what his golden boy brother had already done at Duke, win a national title. The patient suspected that, indeed, he was not good enough and didn't want to face all that would mean for his sense of purpose, his identity. A less clinical diagnosis would go like this. The kid's an effing bozo. I was an effing mess, Hurley says. My nerves were shot. And then to compound matters for him, his Seton Hall team his freshman year ends up playing his brother's Duke team in the NCAA tournament. So even though Danny is just a freshman, averaging 12 minutes a game, CBS, of course, hypes this up as the Hurley versus Hurley game. It's in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. So that's the theme and what the media globs onto for this game. And so Danny's just wearing all of this on his already burnt-out psyche. He's locked up. He says he had fever sores, he couldn't sleep, he could barely speak. The guy's going through a lot of emotional pain here. And a quick aside, a very shrewd and cold coaching move by PJ Carlesimo here. He uses the state that Danny's in, and on the other side, his brother Bobby's love for Danny, to get in Bobby Hurley's head at Duke. Just listen to what it says in the book. PJ knew that Bob knew that I was struggling, that I was suffering at Seton Hall, and he knew that Bob had compassion and sympathy for his little bro, which would surely F with Bobby's head, because Bob always needed to hate his opponent. I was the person in Bob's life who he loved the most, so Bob's love was going to be the leverage we needed to jam him up. Pretty diabolical, he says of PJ. And it did work, at least in that narrow respect. Duke still won that game 89-61, but it says Bob was a shell of himself in that game, playing tentatively, missing 5 out of 7 shots in both his free throws, and he finished with more turnovers 6 than points 4. So a very unusual game for Bobby Hurley, but that Duke team was the defending national champs, They were stacked beyond Hurley. This will end up being year 2 of them winning back-to-back national championships. And actually just 2 nights after that game, the Hurley versus Hurley game, there's probably the greatest college basketball game of all time, where Leitner catches that Hail Mary pass from Grant Hill against Kentucky in overtime, and Leitner hits that turnaround jumper at the buzzer to win the game. And to clear Bobby Hurley's name, he plays great in that Kentucky game. He finished with 22 points, 10 assists, a more typical performance for him. Like I said earlier, he was a phenomenal college player. Moving on to sophomore year for Dan Hurley at Seton Hall, things get a bit better, but he's still making some lapses in judgment. He's still struggling quite a bit. He struggled with PJ Carlesimo yelling, which is interesting because he grew up with a masterclass yeller in his dad. And that's probably because his nerves were shot, but also maybe because of that element that his dad was family. And even though he was a tough, intense guy, he probably still knew at the end of the day it's his dad. He has to love him. It's a bit easier to roll your eyes, which Dan Hurley says he was world class at doing with his dad. It's easier to do that, in a sense, with the parent-child dynamic. And maybe with PJ, since he's just another guy, a family friend, or just another coach who wasn't family, that stung a little bit more when he yelled, and maybe made it feel a bit more personal for Hurley, and he couldn't just chalk it up to his dad being tough on him. He also struggled with the style of play at Seton Hall and how PJ ran the offense. Carlesimo liked to give it to the 2-guard and pound it inside over and over, and there wasn't a ton of point guard freedom in that system. So that was difficult for Danny because he was used to being a playmaker and a point guard with freedom to create. He said of he and Carlesimo, they interacted at practice, but then when we hit the showers, that was that. And for me, he says, admittedly a needy kid, that wasn't enough. Dan Hurley's love language, if you will, based off that needy kid comment, is probably words of affirmation. And I'm not just getting that from that comment. Throughout this book, you can tell he definitely wants those records, the recognition, the title, the praise. He appreciates those affirmations, those validations. They're definitely on his mind. And of course, all coaches want titles and everything else, but I compare this to Dean Smith, whom I'm reading about right now as well, and his love language is definitely not that. It was probably acts of service or some quiet satisfaction of doing a good job or something like that. Smith actually hated recognition, and he was at or amongst his most miserable times in coaching when he was going to break Adolph Rupp's scoring record, and he absolutely hated the hoopla around that. Smith considered quitting before and during that. And I'm not saying Smith's superior to Dan Hurley because he's this way. I'm just noting the difference. I will say that Hurley's way, though, chasing those external things is naturally more volatile because it's relying on things much more outside your control. But anyway, getting back to Dan's time at Seton Hall, and in part because of Carlesimo's style and how it wasn't a good fit for Dan, but also because of all the other factors we discussed, Hurley's really struggling with anxiety and burnout here, and all the partying isn't helping. Just listen to what rough shape he's in and what rough shape his game is in. My shooting mechanics went first, he says. I was wound so tight I couldn't get into any flow. Then I couldn't even catch the damn ball. My anxiety was so out of control, my hands became like robot claws. It was the yips, plain and simple. Though there was much less understanding back then about those sorts of psychological injuries. I was getting good shots and I was passing them up, not wanting to miss. And people thought I was just a candy ass. Shoot for F's sake. Shoot the ball. I wasn't even making smart passes. I was just trying to get rid of the ball. Some games I felt so much pressure, I couldn't even make a basic dribble move. And man, I'm sharing a lot about me in this episode, but I can relate, and my little brother could too. He played D3 basketball and had moments like this. But I certainly did throughout athletics. You get that sort of blackout type of thing from stress here. I was a decent baseball player and a little league baseball player, and my coach had me playing at 9 years old up in the majors and 10 years old, and I was doing pretty good. But then my 11 and 12-year-old seasons, I got wigged out because he asked me to be more of a leader on the team, just normal stuff to ask of a kid, being in his last 2 years of a program, if you will. But it wigged me out. Again, I was a thinker, kind of like Coach Hurley, someone who's prone to anxiety and depression, and especially as a kid when you don't have any perspective on that or you know of any coping skills, these sorts of things can really derail your psyche, because mine definitely wasn't Bob Hurley Sr. or Jr. level of fortitude either. I was a bit more sensitive to comments and an overthinker and a feeler, much like Dan Hurley was or is. And so I think this may have been similar to how PJ Carlesimo might have wigged Dan out with his yelling. It psyched him out. And same for me in my little league and high school baseball career, if I'm honest, fell into the same mental traps. And you get so tight, you're taking tons of pitches, you're not swinging at anything, you're booting the ball in the infield. That's what Dan was doing at Seton Hall. He says, I couldn't make a basic dribble move. My hands were like robot claws. And these are terrible, traumatic, confidence-crushing experiences. It just looks like you're a weakling out there, and people are like, what's wrong with this guy? But you know, to offer something more constructive here, I think MLB manager Joe Maddon has a great articulation and antidote to this, which is essentially performance anxiety that we're talking about. And in Maddon's book, The Book of Joe, he says the anxiety part gets down to when you're thinking about outcomes. And I think it's that outcomes part that's really, really critical here and really defines the name of the saboteur, if you will, in the whole thing, which can be very helpful to square up to and realize. For Danny, the outcomes he was dwelling on was being great like his brother, or for me, it was getting in my head about being a leader, or now that I'm a starter on varsity, or whatever outcome pressure I put on myself with those labels. As Madden says, you're just not going to play as well when you're thinking about outcomes. You're just not. Everyone knows that when you're in the zone and you're playing your best, you're not thinking about anything, and you're just a kid. You're just a human being out there playing and doing what comes organically and naturally to you. And so I think that's it. It's the dwelling on outcomes. You play your best, again, when you're hardly thinking, when you're in that childlike state, and you're just out there being in the moment with your buddies, that sort of thing. I share this in the Joe Madden episode as well, but I think someone who personifies this maybe better than anyone on the planet is Scotty Scheffler in golf. Golf, wow, you talk about a game where you're focused on outcomes, and you have a lot of time to think about them, and it's a mental game. That's the one. But Scotty Scheffler repeatedly says his identity isn't wrapped up in golf and winning tournaments. That's another way of saying he's not wrapped up in the outcomes. He's a faithful guy, he's a Christian guy, and he says what his identity's wrapped up in is his faith. He repeatedly says his victory is secured in the Lord. And what he means by that is it's not in his hands. And so he goes out there with that freedom, and he doesn't have to think about being in the moment, he just plays. And you can see that in his face, his body language. Even in these huge tournaments, there's a peace about him. There's an ease about him. And I think it's that peace he has out there that allows him to go out there and kick his leg back at the end of his swing, let his instincts take over, and just have that freedom and be moving and grooving out there. And as a result, he's played some out-of-this-world golf. And I think that's a really big part of it, is how he is slotted into not being worried about outcomes and not having his identity wrapped up in them. Compare that to the rest of the field who's grinding, who's putting pressure on themselves. They got to be successful for their identity as a golfer. They got to make money to cover travel costs and to support their family. And they've got all these outcomes that are swirling in their heads. Scheffler casts those aside, anchors himself in his Christian faith, and amazing things have happened for that guy. I think that if that guy didn't surrender his life to Christ in that way, that he just wouldn't play as well as he has. I just don't. God's used that guy's life in amazing ways. And getting back to Joe Madden, his antidote is similar, but more secular. It is something that he calls the process is fearless, which I love as well. Meaning, don't think about the outcomes, just think about the process. Think about getting your feet in a good position on the ground ball and about making a good throw to first. At the plate, just think about hitting one up the middle, that sort of stuff. A little bit of thinking, but not too much, and certainly not thinking about outcomes. If you keep yourself grounded in that process stuff, that helps you stay in the moment and anchored in that place where you can just play the game the way you're intended to play. Back to Dan Hurley, he has a much-needed moment with his brother in December of 1993, and it's a great brotherly moment. It's a great sibling moment. Bobby shows up for him here in a way that only siblings can. It's true that only siblings know how you grew up because they were in that household as well, and they had those same parents. And so it's December 4th of 1993, and both their teams play in Madison Square Garden in New York. The Hurley doubleheader, the media labels it. Bobby's now in the NBA with the Sacramento Kings. They're playing the Knicks, of course, and Seton Hall plays St. John's that same day. And Dan says both of them weren't great in their games, but they met up in Greenwich Village in New York afterward. And it's late that night, it's at 2 a.m., they're at a pancake and fries joint, and this really important moment happens. It's the first step in Danny squaring up to this. It's a great moment of unconditional family love on the part of Bobby. And it's the first moment where Danny realizes he can get some space from this to work on his mental health. He says of that night, "It's when I told Bob I was losing my mind, that my entire life was unraveling. I told him that I effing hated basketball. I don't think I also told him that I hated myself. I confessed ominously that I was very close to a dark place. I told him that I was done, that I couldn't do it anymore." So again, Danny's dangerously out of balance. He's been over-leveraged by basketball for too long. And this is the part where he talks about other areas of his life that he's been neglecting, which I think is really important that he acknowledges this and understands this. So he says in this section, "My psyche was about to collapse like a three-legged table. I didn't identify as a student, as a Christian, as a brother, as a boyfriend, as a son. I strictly identified as Danny Hurley, number 15, who obviously, painfully, irrevocably sucks at basketball." He goes on and gets some really important stuff to the surface here. He says, "What I felt in that moment, the depression, the loneliness, the zero self-worth, was a pain no one should ever have to endure. A pain so many do endure every day in silence. And I had to tell someone. I didn't have a girlfriend or a best friend, and I didn't dare tell Dad. It was hard," he says of the conversation with Bob. "No conversation has ever been harder. We grew up in Jersey City, and we prided ourselves on toughness. We were trained to believe that vulnerability was weakness. You're suffering? Then suffer, but shut up about it. Keep it to your effing self." Now, not only was I sharing it with Bob, but I was asking for his permission to do something about it, the unthinkable. I was asking for his permission to leave the game. I was asking him for a pass to abandon the family business. And here's where Bobby comes in really clutch. Dan says, "If he had said to me, 'Bro, go dust yourself off, get back in there,' I'd have done it. I'd have been back to practice the next day, no doubt. But he didn't say that. He looked at me in the eye with tremendous compassion and said, 'I get it, bro. Do what you need to do. Take care of yourself. I got you.'" Beautiful moment there. Danny says, oh man, that was exactly what I needed to hear. With his approval, his blessing, I took that step. Walked away from Seton Hall and basketball. I shook it off like it was a coat that no longer fit. So what a great brotherly moment there, a great unconditionally loving moment. Like he says, that's not how they grew up. And Dan was probably half scared and half expecting that his brother would say, dust yourself off and get back out there. But he doesn't. Bobby transcends all the Jersey City stuff and their dad's stuff and just loves on his brother in this moment. This again reminds me so closely of a moment I had with my little brother when we both transferred to this Division III school. He played basketball, I played baseball, but I just knew it wasn't for me, and I was struggling, and it was an over-engineered move, and there was a heavy element of struggles our dad was going through that got us there in the first place. But I quickly realized I should have stayed at Gonzaga. But I felt embarrassed and in some way shameful about abandoning that experience with my brother or quitting on it. But my little brother was right there for me too, almost said the exact same things Bobby told Danny. I get it, bro. Do what you need to do. Take care of yourself. And that was a big turning point for me. I took control of my own life, went back to Gonzaga, and a lot of good things happened from there for me. But that encouragement of my brother meant the world to me, and so I really resonate with this moment that Dan and Bobby have. Dan does stop basketball immediately. He leaves the program, and he says he doesn't do it in the right way. He basically goes AWOL, and I think that's just a sign of how desperate he was. You know, he needed it all to stop. In hindsight, I'm thinking, too, how fortunate it was that both Bobby and Danny played in New York that day and could have that moment face-to-face. In 1993, they didn't have FaceTime or these other things that allow you to communicate with a little more intimacy or nonverbals when you're on other sides of the country, and so you needed to rely on those in-person moments. And very fortunate that those circumstances converged so they could have that moment in New York when Dan was struggling so much, because this guy was in a dangerous place. He didn't have a lot left in the tank. But yeah, Dan goes AWOL. He says he didn't tell Coach Carlissimo. He didn't tell his parents. He locks himself in a dorm room for 3 days in this really dark, difficult place. And you know, he was 19, so you don't always know how to handle those situations when you're 19, especially when you're struggling with mental health. I think he said he didn't eat and barely drank for those 3 days. He finally calls his sister, and she's the one who told their parents. And within hours, his mom comes. And it's a great mother-son moment here as well. He says there's a knock at the door, and there had been many knocks at the door, but he'd ignored them all. But on the other side of this one, he heard, Danny, it's me, Mom. That was a Tuesday, he said, my 3rd day in hiding. I opened the door a crack. I can't imagine the scene that she encountered as she walked in looking around. I couldn't make eye contact with her. I felt too ashamed. She loved me. And Hurley says he didn't cry, that he never cried in front of her or his father his whole life. And so even in this moment, he's holding on to some toughness. He says, I wasn't going to start now. But he says, I did tell her, however, that I was broken. A broken person. Those were my words, broken person, and they broke her heart. She said, I don't want to see you like this. This isn't worth it. Oof. Painful, but also beautiful moment and the start of some healing there. You can feel that Band-Aid being ripped off, and it's sort of that first step that he's going to start to move to some light and some space and some healing in his life. So his mom is trying to help him. She makes an appointment for him with a psychiatrist, and she went with him to that visit. And he suggested Prozac or something like that. And Danny said, those work miracles for many every day, and they can be really great, but he knew that he needed something different. And so his mom helped him find his way to Sister Catherine Waters, who was the director of Seton Hall's counseling services. Sister Catherine is a key figure in Danny's life. God provides him with exactly the person he needed at this moment in Sister Catherine. And this highlights just that blessing that a good counselor, whatever form that takes, a friend, a spouse, a psychiatrist, a counselor like Sister Catherine was, how when you find that fit in someone who understands and is a good listener, that's a huge, huge, huge thing. So anybody out there going through something like that, keep looking for those people. They can make the difference in your life, and Sister Catherine was that for Danny here. She gave him that handout and hand up that he needed. And Dan Hurley makes the point to say in the book that he was really glad that she was a woman, because being from Jersey City, being a Jersey City guy, he probably would have held back if there was a guy in front of him, just out of that pride, not wanting to show weakness in any way. That's very much a guy thing, right? But this is the beauty of women and their nurturing abilities and their ability to comfort and help and heal. Guys like Danny or me would be lost without our wives being like this, without this beautiful person, Sister Catherine, being this way. Just listen to what he says of Sister Catherine. This soft-voiced nun, this older, wiser, open-hearted woman, was just what the doctor ordered. She was smiling from the jump, and there was so much in that smile. Mercy, for one thing, and hope and love and forgiveness. The humanity of that smile made me breathe easier. She didn't look at me as a Hurley. She looked at me as a human. She didn't give a shoot, I think you know what word he's using there, about the vaunted Hurley name, the basketball legacy. She didn't know much about sports. She wasn't some mental skills coach, some performance psychologist. She didn't meet with me to get me back on my feet so that I could go out there to drop 20 against St. John's. She simply wanted to put me back together, rebuild me, restore me. She wanted to teach me how to love myself. So just an incredible character here that's impartial to basketball, doesn't give a rip about basketball, but does give a rip about Dan as a human. And I think it's almost the first time someone is deeply seeing him in that way, aside from basketball. And this is huge, huge, huge for his psyche to be recognized in this way, to realize that there's more in him than basketball, and to start to usher in some of that balance back into his life. He says, "She made me think, if this nice lady can look at me with such mercy, such hope, I must not be a lost cause. There must be something about me worth saving." Important stuff here, and I agree with him. If you're a guy out there struggling with this stuff, seek out a female counselor. It might be just the angle you need to come at this from because of those beautiful innate gifts that women so often can carry. And keep using trial and error. In other words, shop around. If it's not a female counselor, seek out a pastor, a priest, a psychiatrist, or whatever works for you. But give yourself a lot of credit for shopping around to do that, and realize that you do have to shop around a lot of times to find that person. Hurley gets very lucky with Sister Catherine, but he also has that experience with that psychiatrist that makes him realize, I need something different than this. So he had to shop around as well, and it paid off. I think so often, and I can relate to this from some of my darker times where I sought out counseling services, sometimes when you're in that state and you go to whatever form the mental health professional takes, and it's a bad experience, it almost makes it worse. It makes you run the other way. It almost doubles down on your trauma during that period because you think, oh my gosh, I must be really messed up. I can't even vibe with this person, this mental health professional. But that is a lie. Look at Coach Hurley's story. I'm here to tell you I've had a couple of those bad experiences and then found a good experience as well at one time in my life with a female counselor. And so just realize that there is a fit that is needed to be found. And it's a blessing when you do, so hang in there. Don't look at the bad experiences as a reflection of you or even the counselor. Just realize this is tricky stuff, and putting people back together is tricky stuff. And it requires the right surgeon, if you will, with the right bedside manner to help you do that in a good way. So keep going. They're out there. Kick the tires, look on their website, see what they're all about, and it'll be worth it when you find that person, I promise you. And so back to Danny, after just one meeting with Sister Catherine, he's feeling great. But what happens next still highlights the yin and the yang and the 2 steps forward and 1 step back nature of how progress is usually made from this point. It's definitely not a rocket ship straight up. So he gets in the car to head back to Jersey City, and he starts getting triggered. He starts thinking about that homecoming, and he spirals backwards, if you will, on that drive. He's thinking about how his dad will meet him, and he's not imagining a kind interaction. He starts with some incredibly harsh and negative self-talk on this drive about him being weak and a failure and soft, and he has suicidal ideation on this drive. This is important too because I'm going to read a difficult passage here, but just think about what is ahead for Coach Hurley here that he cannot see. I mean, wild success as a coach. 2 national championships, back-to-back for crying out loud, an offer to coach LeBron James's Los Angeles Lakers, a marquee NBA franchise, a great wife, and 2 awesome sons. And this is exactly what anxiety and human nature and mental health issues and the dark forces of this world can make you do, can make you lose hope, believe lies, and lose touch with reality. But this is where Dan Hurley is at as a college kid, which can be tough because you're not old enough to have this perspective. And young Dan says here, I thought to myself, is anything worth this kind of suffering? Can there even be another side to this kind of suffering? And again, yes, there can. You'll be a 2-time national championship coach, and you'll have an offer to coach the Lakers, and your family life will be solid. But he goes on with his internal thoughts during this time and says, and can I ever get to that other side? Is there any kind of decent life after this kind of suffering? And if so, do I even deserve it? And it says, ahead he saw a pole, and he says, very clearly, I thought it would be over quick. I saw huge trees looming on the side of the highway. I imagined spinning the wheel, turning hard to the right, going headfirst into one of the biggest trees. Everything would be dark and over. Finally, no more pain, no more hate. So he's thinking all of this, but again, the best is yet to come for Dan. He's a late bloomer. Never give up out there. There's always a dawn after the darkest hours like this, and usually it's a brilliant one. It can take some time to get there, but it always comes. But credit to Dan Hurley in this moment as well. It gets scary for him, but a force or a light comes out within him. He says in the book, I thought about it and I thought about it, felt my mind and muscles organizing to do it, and yet I didn't. I started telling myself, nah, not like this. You're going to get yourself fixed. You're going to get yourself right. It's just basketball doing this to you. And so F basketball. He's giving himself permission there, space, depersonalizing what he's going through, which is an important first step. And I also want to note, he obviously comes back to basketball. So sometimes the thing that's causing you all this angst and pain is something you do actually love, and that's why it's causing you all this pain and angst. But maybe you just need to reset it or rebalance it or re-engage it in a different way. I also think in these moments it's important to not think in absolute terms, in feast or famine terms, like basketball or no basketball. Maybe it's just that you need to reset the relationship with basketball or relationship with whatever might be causing that pain. There probably is a lot of love there, and that's why you had the thing in your life in the first place. Maybe not, but probably. And re-engaging that and finding help and finding balance and nurturing other aspects of your life and identities that you have and your faith might be just what you need to rebalance and re-engage that thing that is causing you burnout, which for Danny was basketball. So when he gets home from that drive, he has to go in and face how his dad's going to react. And he doesn't know. And I feel like this moment for Bob Hurley Sr. is about as gushy as the man can get. It's actually a great moment in an understated male, I can't show my emotions way. So Danny says, I don't think Dad knew anything about Sister Catherine. I don't think my mom breathed a word about all that. But he did know that I'd left the team and that I was in a bad way. As I walked in the door, he wrapped his arms around me. I felt the wind go out of me. I felt loved. So great moment there, better than expected homecoming in regards to how his dad greeted him. And Dan actually says that ironically, and to our point earlier about re-engaging with the thing you love, he says he really enjoyed watching basketball, the thing he thought was his big trigger and nemesis at this stage. He says something in this section about watching basketball with his dad, even though it was in silence, felt more like an embrace than awkward silence. The two of them were just sitting there watching games and not saying much, but that there was kind of an unspoken love and support there. However, that Sunday, just days after he gets home, and he's in a bad way and needing to heal and beginning that process, he and his mom and his dad are gathered in the living room watching Bobby play for the Sacramento Kings against the Los Angeles Clippers. And he says, the feeling among us was good. We were all happy, riveted, rooting. I felt kind of warm and safe and interested for the first time in a long while. But then he says the phone rang. And this was the news they were getting about Bobby Hurley's famous and tragic auto accident. For those of you that don't know, Bobby Hurley Jr. got hit leaving the Arco Arena where the Sacramento Kings play. I think he was T-boned in his forerunner and he was thrown 125 feet and almost died, maybe should have died. I'm talking he had 2 collapsed lungs, a ruptured trachea, broken ribs, a compression fracture in his back, and a torn ACL. But again, the guy's nails, he came back from this. He never really fully recovered as a player, though. So anyway, Danny's in rough shape at home from college, off the team, hurting mentally and emotionally, and now Bobby gets in this life-threatening car accident. So unbelievable as a parent or person how sometimes these bad things, or good things to be fair, can converge at the same time, and you're just like, what? Can this really be happening right now? But the silver lining, I guess, is it puts both these Hurley brothers and the whole family sort of on this long road to recovery. And for Danny's part, he and Sister Catherine are meeting 3 times a week, and he says it was like repairing a shattered piece of pottery. Fine, painstaking work, lots of attention to micro detail, and it was all interior. But throughout it all, Danny can tell it's working slowly. Again, these things aren't a snap of the finger, which is important to remember, but things get better one little win at a time. He's sort of bottomed out, and now he's ratcheting himself back up. And in parallel, his brother Bobby's doing the same thing physically. He's fighting to recover from all the trauma and everything else his body went through. And that in itself was also fine, painstaking work physically and mentally and emotionally as well. Danny, during this time with Sister Catherine's nudging, does something that's very heroic to me. And this is a moment that almost certainly won't make the short bios of him as a coach or a player. You know, those bios will be about his 2 national championships and his coaching stops and everything else. But it probably should be in there because it's a champion moment. This kid is 20 or 21 or something like that. This is the early 90s when society wasn't as permitting of mental health needs at large. It was still a time when society was more black and white about weak and strong and didn't exactly have a culture of nuance about these things. So what he does take some stones. And what I'm talking about is he held a press conference about what he was going through mentally and emotionally. And the audience was the beat writers who covered Seton Hall. So he's in front of these sports writers, these media people, squaring up to this as a young kid, telling them something that was taboo. But he does it with some brass. He says in the book, I told the beat writers who covered Seton Hall that I had left the team because I had difficulty coping with stress. Full stop. And that I was in counseling to deal with my low self-esteem and depression. And that I never again wanted to feel what I had felt over those 3 or 4 days holed up in my dorm room. And that PJ, Carlissimo, the coach, had been totally supportive, and that I didn't realize he was such a caring guy when he was on my you-know-what every day. The press corps laughed at that last comment. He brought some levity into it with the PJ comments there. But what guts? Again, this is the early 90s, and the main identity he knows is being this big, strong athlete. But he's sitting there telling this press corps that he's in counseling, telling them that he's not handling stress well and that he's going through depression. He's doing this all publicly. And that's why I absolutely love Coach Hurley's anxiety story, if you will. He's direct, and he doesn't hide or massage the story or forget about it. He keeps it out there for people to learn from, puts his shoulders back, and talks about it objectively so that it doesn't live in darkness, so that some light can be shed on it. That's so important, and I so admire him for how he does that, especially as a 21-year-old kid here. And so as a really cool silver lining, it's during this time that Dan's away from Seton Hall, away from basketball, at home, that his impetus to coach shows up. And it's sort of like God's plan for him for this next chapter starts to show up. Slowly, these bright spots start to appear, and he moves into this newer, brighter season. He says that his dad and his parents were understandably struggling with Bobby being banged up and almost dying and on the road to recovery, and Danny being in this tough chapter of his life as well. And that even their really strong dad, that it got to him, and how could it not? And he says that his dad was never a big drinker, but he was starting to have a couple drinks at night to numb the pain of all of this going on. It obviously didn't work. It actually brought his health back a few steps. He ended up getting pneumonia. But this is sort of where fate is stepping in. Bob Sr. asked Danny to help him with his St. Anthony's basketball team while he was healing up from pneumonia and down for the count with that. And Danny says, I was shocked and beyond hesitant, but there was only one answer. I told him I'd do whatever he needed. And so this is where Coach Dan Hurley begins, in this awesome way, doing it out of an act of service to his dad. And it's at this moment where he's allowed himself the space to heal, to reset his relationship with basketball, that this moment is ushered in this perfect kind of way. Dan Hurley says, it's crazy, but filling in for Dad and coaching at good old St. Anthony's, returning to my roots, helped me reignite my love of the game. It was the first time I touched a ball in weeks, months, and it felt so damn good. All of it felt so good, like seeing an old friend whom you'd had a beef with, but you can't seem to remember what the beef was about. I love teaching the players about the game. I was coaching, although I didn't think of it as coaching. I thought of it as helping Dad, being Dad. Whatever it was, I didn't want to examine it too closely. I just wanted to enjoy the hell out of it. To me, this is it. This is Dan Hurley surrendering to things, and now the work can begin, of God, of fate, doing what needs to be done, getting him where he's supposed to be. In his own words, he said he's enjoying the heck out of it. He didn't think of it as coaching. And he realizes, wow, maybe this is something that found me. Maybe I'm going to be a better coach than a player, or maybe I don't even have to think of it this way. Maybe I just love coaching and teaching this game, and I'm just going to follow that. But he still does go back to playing to finish his Seton Hall career. So he's healing all throughout 1993, and in the fall of 1994, he returns to Seton Hall, and everything has changed. PJ Carlesimo was actually gone, which again seems like God helping out a young Dan and putting some of these pieces of oxygen on his road to recovery. Carlesimo goes on to coach in the NBA with the Portland Trail Blazers. I remember this. I was a middle schooler in Portland at the time. But Carlesimo's replacement at Seton Hall is Coach George Blaney, and this guy's like another Sister Catherine in Hurley's life. So more manna from the heavens here. He's had the darkest hour, and things start to get better. And he says about Coach Blaney, whom he loved, and who was the first nurturing type of coach, positive, caring coach. He didn't have that with PJ Carlesimo and his dad. And importantly, he says it wasn't an anti-PJ thing. He loved PJ personally, but it was just more that he found Coach Blaney's style a great fit for him. Not unlike how we talked about with counselors. Not every coach is going to be a great fit, just as every counselor who's really a coach isn't either. So Hurley says in the book, immediately after Blaney replaced PJ, he started reaching out to me, asking those questions that had nothing to do with basketball. He asked questions like, how are you doing in school? And do you have a girlfriend? And who are you hanging out with? On and off the court. And did you go to mass yesterday? Are you drinking? Dan Hurley says, to see a coach care about me so much, to see him unafraid to show personal interest, changed everything. He saw that I was damaged, wounded, and it didn't make him like me any less. It made him like me more. So Hurley is getting more oxygen here, more balance. Coach Blaney, a much more gentle, caring soul than any coach he's had before. And this is huge for Hurley, and it carries over to the court as well. Hurley says, Coach Blaney was steadfast and resolutely calm. It was like playing for the neighborhood priest. Through Blaney's calm, I became calmer on the court. I grew in confidence, started believing in my game again. 5 games into the season, 2 days after undergoing a double root canal, I scored a career-high 25 points in a victory over Wagner. And so I just want to make the point here that it takes all types, and maybe Bobby Hurley Jr. was a better fit for Bob Hurley Sr.'s style, and different types of players and personalities maybe need different types of coaches. But to me, there really is no substitute for positive coaching as Coach Blaney exhibits here. It's the Blaneys, the John Wooden types, the Jay Wright at Villanova types, or Dean Smith at North Carolina types. These guys that treat the whole person and run their program like a family, that aren't just trying to beat you down to make you a basketball mercenary. It's all coming from a positive place, and a place that's more holistic, if you will. They're thinking about you and setting you up for success for the next 40 years of your life, not just the next 4 years, and that works, and that you can have wild success and championship-level winning doing that. And Dan Hurley proves this later, and all those guys whose names I just rattled off prove it as well. And so Coach Blaney helps turn around Dan Hurley's playing career at Seton Hall. He goes on to average 14 points a game under his 2 full seasons under Coach Blaney, and he finished his Seton Hall career with more than 1,000 points scored. Coach Hurley says of this time, while I've talked a lot over the years about being haunted by my failures as a player, I have to say, it's not easy to score 1,000 points in a big-time Division I program, or to average 14 points in the Big East. I'm proud of those numbers because they're more than numbers. They have a context, a backstory, that make them a symbol of personal endurance. So again, Dan Hurley was a great player, but what an awesome time, what an awesome turnaround this Seton Hall chapter of his life was. Again, it's not going to be the one covered in most of the public media bios about him, but it's where he sets the foundation, the trajectory, and has all these defining moments. You can't help but think that the hand of God is involved with this once he surrenders and squares up to things by putting Sister Catherine in his life and Coach Blaney in his life, and that spark to become a coach himself when he takes over for his dad's team. It's just a beautiful chapter. And Coach Hurley closes this section of his life in this chapter in the book by saying, when I look around for people to thank, it was Mom and Dad, Sister Catherine, and of course Coach Blaney. That man made it happen. That man's support and belief taught me so much about manhood. He modeled what it meant to be a good man, a quiet leader. When it was all over, I had the clearest thought. How awesome would it be to change someone's life the way Coach Blaney changed mine? So again, boom, a new man is born, a coach is born. God bless all these people who supported him in this, his parents, his brother, Sister Catherine, Coach Blaney, And God bless Coach Hurley for sharing this stuff. It's not easy to share, but he gives us an amazing section in the book on this stuff. But let's talk about some of his mistakes and failures. As I said in the opener, this is a flawed guy. And it's not like he goes on to be a Boy Scout here after this, and that his behavior's perfect, and that he doesn't struggle with anything anymore. He still does, but he makes great progress on it. He learns elite coping skills. He helps others along the way. And at Wagner and Rhode Island, he's continuing to grow as a man and a coach. But I want to get into this Uconn chapter of his life, and specifically some of the mistakes and failures he had, so we can learn from those and how he responded to those. But mostly because it's just an awesome story about how he evolves as a human and a coach. So starting right off, he totally fumbles how he takes the Uconn job in the first place. And this is insightful, if not just entertaining in a somewhat cringeworthy way to learn about here. As I alluded to, before Uconn, he's at Rhode Island. He has some great success there. He turns that program around, and he's getting opportunities to move up to a bigger school, to a higher pay grade. And he has mixed feelings about that. You know, he's got a good thing going at Rhode Island, and he's built that program. They've got good recruits in the pipeline. Their success is continuing to bud there. But he is talking to Pitt and Uconn. And anyway, he and his wife ultimately decide on Uconn. It's a blue blood type of basketball school and a great opportunity. So they tell his agent to call Uconn and inform them that he's going to take the job. So his agent does. He calls Dave Benedict at Uconn, lets them know. And as I understand it, they're supposed to send over that signed contract shortly after that. But 20 minutes later, this package shows up from Pitt at Hurley's house. It's got all this swag in it and hats and banners and t-shirts. And in typical chaotic Danny Hurley fashion, this kind of gets in his head. And he tells his wife, nope, it's Pitt. It's Pitt. I'm serious. And he tells his wife to call his agent Jordan back and tell them that they're going to go to Pitt. But his agent says, whoa, slow down. Stop and think a minute. He encourages Hurley to just buy a little bit of time. And his agent actually falls asleep at the desk. And so these Uconn people are like, whoa, what happened? Why haven't we heard back from this guy? He called and told us that this was a done deal. We were expecting the contract to come over at any minute, but they're just getting crickets. So Uconn's feeling like this guy left him at the altar. But his agent finally wakes up at 2:30 a.m., sees all these calls from Dave Benedict, the Uconn AD, ultimately gets back to him and tells him Hurley will take the job. And so Hurley says of this in the book, not the careful, joyful first step that everyone wanted. Pure chaos, but it was classically Hurley. Hurley also says he never stopped wondering how life might have been different if that box of Pittsburgh swag showed up 20 minutes earlier, and if he had committed to Pittsburgh in the first place without committing to Uconn. But the deal was done with Uconn, 6 years, a starting salary of $2.75 million. However, the drama isn't done. He gets to Uconn, and he's still really neurotic, and probably his anxiety heightens all these neurotic traits he has. And first he's thinking, man, this is cool. I'm the Uconn coach. These facilities are state-of-the-art, and I can't believe this is my job. But then a couple days after being there, he says, I asked myself, what were you thinking? This rebuild is going to kill me. I have to take this school from where we are right now to winning a national championship. Rebuilds back then took time, he said. There were no shortcuts. There was no portal. No NIL to bail your rear end out. It was pure program building. I called Jordan, that's his agent, and asked him to dig into the contract, get me the buyout information. I asked him about the possibility of returning to Rhode Island. So again, even after that messy accepting of the job, a few days later he's trying to back out of it again. Pure chaos, pure Hurley, as he said. His agent does contact Dave Benedict. This guy has to just be worn to pieces at this point, the poor guy. And Hurley's agent asks him about the buyout contract, and Benedict tells him it would cost them a couple $1 million. That's a couple $1 million out of Dan Hurley's pocket. And his agent tells Hurley, you signed the contract already, idiot. Uconn is not going to let you out. And so Hurley, in his desperate state here, reaches out to Uconn great Jim Calhoun. It says of Calhoun in the book, he was the Boston tough guy who built this program from nothing into something special with his bare working class hands. Calhoun won 3 championships at Uconn. And Dan's thinking he might find a sympathetic ear, and he doesn't, and this is great. Dan says, as I started rattling off my list of grievances, Coach wasn't buying. He was glaring, staring holes into my face. I knew what was coming as soon as I stopped babbling, and sure enough, when I finally wound down, Calhoun cleared his throat and said, you're being a punk. What? Hurley said. You sound whiny, Calhoun said. Get the hell out of here. Go tell the AD to do what he needs to do. Go tell the boosters to do what they need to do. Or maybe they shouldn't have hired you for this job. God bless Jim Calhoun for saying that. I remember him, but I want to know more about this guy after that line and hopefully do an episode on him as well. But anyway, this tough love from Calhoun helps get Danny's head right. He says, anytime you tell a coach you're in crisis and ask what you should do, the answer is always going to be the same. Coach him up. Coach him up. It was just like talking to my dad, only more so. In other words, it was exactly what I needed. That's gold. I love that. Coach 'em up. Coach 'em up. I think of Joe Madden's The Process is Fearless slogan, or John Wooden's focus on the details. Things that keep you in the moment, not obsessing over your poor facilities or good facilities or where you need to take the program or recruits you're not getting or all these external things that are the enemy. They're the life and energy suckers you have to avoid. This coach 'em up thing also reminds me of a Buddhist proverb, or koan as I think they call them. What does one do before enlightenment? Chop wood and carry water. What does one do after enlightenment? Chop wood and carry water. Or even the model of my high school, Jesuit High School in Portland, Oregon, which is age quod agis, which is Latin for do what you're doing and do it well, meaning stay in the moment, give yourself totally to that moment in the work. Don't let obsessing over the outcomes or uncontrollables distract you. So that's what Calhoun is telling him, and this helps get Danny's head right. And so he finally settles in and starts working on turning the program around. The 2018-2019 and 2019-2020 seasons are very mediocre, 500 type of ball. 2021 ends up being a little bit better. I think they went 15-8, but the season wasn't super great. Down the stretch, they screwed up a game against Maryland and lost that. And then in the Big East semifinal in 2021, they screwed up a game against Creighton, in Hurley's words. And this is where I want to highlight some of the negative coaching mistakes he makes and how he course corrects them and how those changes made all the difference. But getting back to where he made those negative coaching mistakes, he says, we screwed up in the final 5 minutes and 7 seconds of the Creighton game. And then we screwed up the entire 40-minute game against Maryland. So I made sure the number 4507, which was the total of all those minutes that he viewed the team as screwing up, was everywhere. That summer it was on the scoreboard, it was on t-shirts and hoodies, and Hurley says while we were using 4507 as a rallying cry to spur us to work harder, we didn't make any real personnel or tactical changes. We just doubled down on working harder and doing the same things we were doing. And I made it worse by bringing attention to our failure, by putting 4507 on everything. We had a tough offseason, in other words, all because of my unforced error. So he's rubbing his players' noses in mistakes and shaming them, though he probably didn't totally see it as that at the time. He probably thought it was motivating and didn't see his mistake till a little bit later on. But he does eventually see it and says, that was my unforced error. In the episode I did on Nick Saban, he shares how at a couple times in his career, and in the book I used as a source text for that, this was only up to his LSU years, but Saban shares that he twice tried negative coaching and it was to no avail. Before a couple big games, he talked up the opponent on the other side, like they were the Dallas Cowboys of old, he said, and he criticized his own team and beat them down, hoping it would get something extra out of them or motivate them. But the players in both those instances didn't respond well. They lost both games. And in at least one of those, Saban shares that senior leadership from that team came to him after it and said, Coach, we like it when you believe in us better. We like it when we believe in ourselves better. So maybe some of this pendulum swinging from positive to negative coaching has to do with society and societal and cultural norms going on during different time periods. But in my opinion, all of these examples seem to point toward checks in the positive coaching column and reinforce that over negative coaching. Maybe negative coaching made some sense during the Great Depression era for those coaches, because that was culturally what was going on. Everything was hard, so sports had to be hard. But from Jesus to John Wooden, I think it's pretty timeless that encouragement and loving your players, your fellow humans, wins, and wins in pretty much an undefeated fashion. So those are fumbles Hurley made early at Uconn, but being the hard case that he can sometimes be, and again I can relate, he makes a very similar mistake shortly after that. The context of this one was that Hurley was so desperate to beat Jay Wright, who was at Villanova at the time and was at the top of the heap of the coaching profession in the Big East and had recently won or was in the process of winning a couple national championships there at Villanova. Hurley lost his head trying to sort of knock Jay Wright off that block, and he became mean and selfish really here because of that. Hurley says, when he lost to them, they lost a hard-fought war to Villanova. He says, I forced my grief onto the players. The loss happened on a Friday night, and instead of staying over in the city and getting some rest in a nice hotel, I loaded everyone onto the bus home immediately after the game. I dragged our rear ends back to Storrs. That's Storrs, Connecticut, where Uconn is, and then hauled everybody into the building the very next morning to watch film. I didn't move our team past the failure at MSG, Madison Square Garden. I marinated them in it all weekend. I took the joy out of going to the NCAA tournament. I took the joy out of playing our first round game against 12 seed New Mexico State, and my players responded about the way you might expect them. They played joyless basketball. So after that loss to Villanova in the Big East tournament, they're still getting into the tournament is what he's saying, but he puts this dark cloud over them with the way he's treating the team and rubbing their nose in the failure of not beating Villanova. And his team comes out flat in the NCAA tournament. And he says, we scored a mere 22 points in the first half and we went down 70-63. So they let New Mexico upset them in the first round of the NCAA tournament. Ouch. An alternate title for this book might have been Learning the Hard Way, the Dan Hurley story. I'm joking a little bit there, but he does have a knack for learning some lessons in epically hard ways. But he does learn them and make adjustments, and that's the important part. And how he responds to this one, again, defines and sets up the success that they have later on. And maybe he should have done this earlier, but life is not always perfectly linear like that. Most of the time it is not. What matters is at some point you look in the mirror and you square up to these things and you approach it with as much truth and grace and personal accountability as you can. And so that's what he does here. And that's where the huge turnaround and the huge winnings start at Uconn. And we can break down his self-reflection about this mistake in berating his team about the Villanova loss and the knock-on effects that had and losing in the first round of the NCAA tournament. We can break this down in three ways. One is that he admits that he was a bad offensive coach. He says, I didn't spend nearly enough time working on it, studying it. I thought I could win a championship just on will and toughness and culture. I found out that those things are great, but they're not enough to make you an all-timer. You can't have any holes in your game. So he admits that he's a bad offensive coach, and he studies all sorts of other stuff, which we'll get into in a minute. And he comes up with some really phenomenal and innovative offenses that even leave his dad in awe. But two, during this time, he also has a meeting of the lead bulls, which is really smart. I'm borrowing that lead bulls language again from Joe Madden, who coined this in his book, The Book of Joe. But it's this concept that as the lead bulls go in a herd, so does the rest of the herd. And in a sports team or at Uconn, this is your senior leadership. This is the best players that are leaders out there. And this is a really important thing to do to get them to buy in because, again, they're the lead bulls. The rest of the herd is going to follow them. And Hurley is really smart how he does this and builds this from the bottom up and builds this off his personnel from the strength of these leaders. He doesn't try to lord things down on him that he decides are right or that he's comfortable with. He looks at the personnel, involves them, and builds around them. And he also changes his tune a bit and uses positive coaching to pump these guys up. So in the book, he says, I needed to come up with a better way. I needed to come up with a whole new plan. And so the first thing I did was sit down with 3 of my returning guys, the core of the team. I was going to build our style of play and our roster around them. Adam Sonogo, my 6'9" center forward, and my 2 guards, Andre Jackson Jr. and Jordan Hawkins. I met with them in our conference room across from my second floor office. I didn't waste a lot of words. I told Sonogo, and here's where the positive coaching comes in, what Jimmy Johnson of the Miami Hurricanes and Dallas Cowboys would call the Pygmalion effect. You're sort of pumping these guys up and manifesting these things with your players by setting their standards really high and getting their minds and their actions to head toward that standard and to try to reach it, if not exceed it. So that's what Coach Hurley does here. He says, I told Sonogo that he was going to be the best player in the Big East. I told Jackson that he was going to be one of the nation's best playmakers. And I told Hawkins that he was going to be one of the nation's best shooters and scorers. I told them that they were going to win a national championship together. I told them like I'd already seen it happen, which I had in my mind. Listen, I said, we're going to make some changes. Some of your teammates are not going to be here. I knew there was going to be a little chaos around the program, but going forward, we're building this thing around you 3. It's your team now. I'm committing to you. I need you to commit to me, to trust me. I have your backs. I'm asking you to have mine. Hurley says they were a little taken back, but he saw it in their eyes that they were also really happy. Damn happy, he says. He said the meeting didn't last more than 20 minutes, but he knew that it would reverberate for months and months. Get the heck out of here. I need to go work, he finished. And so I love this. He made that decision to do things differently and to have this meeting of the lead bulls and to build around them. And in doing that, he did something else I really love. He didn't just chase 4- and 5-star recruits for sake of them being 4- or 5-star recruits and just collecting those guys like it was some sort of competition. He started to recruit character more and team chemistry more. He says, I wasn't going to try to please anybody. I was going to recruit players with natural ability who fit our system and our plan. There's something to this. This is so important. I think of my alma mater, Gonzaga, and what Mark Few does, what all good coaches do who sustain winning, or maybe it's more something that they have. It's a keen eye for character and personality and a vision for how all those will mesh together and how a coach and his staff can coach these guys. And this is the same in the NFL, how they draft guys just based on stats and maybe don't factor in character or team chemistry enough or their offense enough. I mean, how many top 25 draft picks do you actually see ending up being franchise guys or even starters? There's a high failure rate there, which tells us there's a whole lot more going on than just a guy's physical specs and his stats. There's the context of the organization, the coach, the locker room, the offense, and really, really high on that list is a person's character and the personality he has and how he'll fit within his new home and with his new teammates and his coach. The NFL seems to take the equivalent of 5-star recruits, aka guys that do well in the combine or are high on the draft board, just because they're high on the draft board or they have these freak combine stats. And maybe you need to do that for the trade value, or you probably do need to do that for the trade value. But beyond that, still trust your instincts. Don't force a guy into your organization that doesn't fit. Use that trade value for him to get guys that do. As Vivian Stringer said in her book, it only takes one dissenting voice to ruin a locker room. And it seems like this gets missed a lot, especially in the NFL. Bill Walsh would agree with Stringer. He said the bottom 20% of your organization determine your success. In other words, the entire team chemistry and the entire team character matter. So making this switch is huge for Hurley's success that is about to take off here. Getting guys that will fit, meshing personalities, building that strong family atmosphere. I want to get back to the way he squared up to his offensive coaching shortcomings. He doesn't toot his horn enough on that in this book, and rightfully so. But I'm thinking reading this is amazing. He goes basically from only coaching toughness and grit and culture, which are important, to coaching incredible offensive innovation and becomes a really elite offensive coach. He and his staff, I should say, they all deserve the credit. It's really cool how they went about this. They hit the books, basically. They studied their you-know-what off. They looked at all sorts of offenses from other sports and different sources. And I love that. As we covered in the Joe Madden episode, studying different disciplines can give you this great crosshatch of information to make decisions from. Joe Madden calls his flavor of that liberal arts baseball, which is partly inspired by his intellectual blossoming he did as a young guy at Lafayette College, a liberal arts school, where he played football and baseball. But it was a very similar thing where you study math, philosophy, the arts, fiction, all sorts of things, to feed your mind with good ideas and creativity to draw from. Hurley and his Uconn staff are doing this in their own way. They approach this offensive quest, I think is a good word to use for it, with great humility and curiosity and a ton of creativity and innovation. And they burst onto the scene with this in 2022-23, but it's because of all this intensive studying, the hard work they do in the offseason. He says, I spent untold hours studying everything from European teams to the WNBA, Division III men's teams, even the NFL. You name it, I looked at them for new strategic and tactical concepts. Something different. He goes on, the majority of NBA and college basketball offenses revolved around ball screens. In other words, most systems were 80 to 90% screens set on the ball. We wanted to be really hard to play against. Why not go 30% ball screens and 70% off the ball movement? Why not do less pick and roll, get away from over dribbling, and do more cutting and passing around the court? He continues, if we could develop a different style, something very few teams in the country were doing, we'd have an advantage come tournament time. He says, my father called our new offense European analytics on steroids mixed with the old Princeton offense under Pete Carrill. So his father was really complimentary of his offense, which speaks volumes. Later in the book, Hurley Sr. says, I'm in absolute awe of what he's done. And he was amazed at how his son got 5 guys to crash the offensive glass. That's high praise, and I'm sure it felt great for Danny to hear that from his dad. So I love this story. You never know it all. And in fact, the more you study, the more you realize how little you know. And Hurley's being a lifelong learner here. This is a very clutch, championship-resulting move by Hurley and the Uconn staff. So he's changing a lot of stuff here, the offense, his coaching style, and that carries over to his recruiting. And there's one recruit that embodies the unlock of this, of a character guy, of a program guy, of the type of offense he wants to run and the type of guys he wants to coach. And that's Alex Karaban, who's actually still with the team. He's with the team in this 25-26 season. I just saw part of their game against DePaul the other night when I was going to pick up some pizzas for my family. But let's go back to the 22-23 season when he brings men to the program. Hurley says, at first glance, he wasn't the kind of player most people would consider the Dan Hurley type. Too suburban. My teams always felt ultra-urban, toughness and grittiness and relentlessness. These were the hallmarks on the surface. Alex didn't slot into that category. He wasn't super flashy on the surface. He didn't seem very tough, and yet he had something intangible. He had an instinctive feel. He was a good shooter, obviously, and had great game processing skills, but it was something beyond that. He just saw the game one dribble and one pass ahead of the rest. His parents were a big factor as well, and if you've listened to any of my other episodes, you know I love that aspect. I love unpacking the parents, the upbringing, the shoulders of giants that these great coaches or players can stand on. It's usually a multi-generational process, and it's great to study those things to learn how to assist your own kids and families and set them up for success. And so Alex Karaban had parents like this. Hurley says in the book, as a bonus, there were his parents raising him. They'd emphasized hard work, accountability, education. They'd produced and delivered to us a superb young man. From the start, I was so deeply impressed by Alex as a human being. And that mattered now. 3 or 4 years earlier, no way I would have taken him. Now things were different. I was different. Hurley continues to say, Alex represented a sea change for me personally. I was no longer compulsively drawn to pure athletic talent alone. I looked deeper, thought harder about the kinds of people I wanted around me and in the building. Not just wearing our uniform and running our plays, but with us on the team playing and in team meetings. So again, character totally matters, and it matters for every person on that team. Coach Hurley says a lot of coaches forsake character for sake of talent, and that happens all the time. And there's good reason, right? It's the easiest thing in the world to overlook potential red flags or a bad fit because someone's a super hyped, super talented at face value, crazy athlete type of person. And in addition to that, most high school coaches or family or close friends or whoever you talk to aren't really going to tell you the truth because they don't want to be the one to tell you about the kid's warts or where they might be falling short or the skeletons he has in his closet. And so Hurley says of their recruiting, they ask a ton of questions. And this part is key. And I would liken this to the investing world where guys like Charlie Munger or Warren Buffett, they try to invert the story on a business or a stock they're interested in investing in, basically to try to talk yourself out of it, to try to take the other side of the case, to disprove the investment, or in this case, disprove the player. And that can be a really enlightening and illuminating way of pressure testing things because the way the human mind works, we're a very good salesman to ourselves, and we can overlook a lot of things when we just focus on the outcome or the bright, shiny parts of a thing, and that can lead to some bad decision-making. So Hurley says this, of all the questions they go through, which is their way of vetting and pressure testing their investment, aka their kids. Is he coachable? Does he give max effort? 3 maxes there. Are his parents crazy? Do his teammates like him? Does his head coach look like he likes being around him? If he plays a bad game, whom does he blame? Whom do his parents blame? Does he have an agent? Who is his agent? how much am I going to have to talk to that agent? He goes on to say they consider other things like body language and on-court interactions, and does a player pick up a teammate who's on the floor? Do they sulk at the end of the bench? Hurley says, sulking is not allowed in my program. There's no blaming, no complaining, no being defensive. But here's the really key quote from Hurley that he has on this that drives the point home. He says, every recruiting season we pass on at least one superstar that raised red flags in those critical areas. You can't win big without top talent, but you also can't win with the wrong top talent. That's key there. Maybe the biggest shift in my thinking, Hurley continues, was in finally realizing that I couldn't just get a bunch of psycho studs who looked like me and played like me. My type of personality works, but only in small doses. I had to stop looking for all fireballs all the time, stop seeking mirror images of myself. I needed balance, a little fire, but a lot of ice. Grit, yes, but also peace. Yellers and warriors, but also soothers. Calm, that was the quality I actively started emphasizing, and it made all the difference. I'm sure those of you in the working world see this with bosses too. Bosses make this mistake of trying to make everyone like themselves, and that's one of the biggest pitfalls you can fall into as a boss or manager, because everyone's different. And actually you need all those differences, but people, being sort of the self-centered creatures that we are most of the time, just think, oh no, this is what works for me. I need a team of clones. I need everyone doing things the way I would do them, and that never works or has sustainability in the long run. Hurley says in this chapter of the book as well, they use the service of a company called HD Intelligence to build this team around their core three, Sonogo, Jackson, and Hawkins. I found this really interesting that they use this service, and I probably should have known this was happening at the college basketball level more because it's everywhere, but having it confirmed and spelt out like this is really interesting as to how much they rely on input from analytics firms like this. And I'm reading from chapter 12 in the book here. He says, HD Intelligence, a basketball analytics company run by a couple of Harvard guys, Matt Dover and Colton Houston. These dudes go deep into advanced statistical analysis to help us figure out basically everything, from which opponents we should schedule to which players we need to beat those opponents. On scheduling, they use algorithms to determine the optimal non-conference opponent, who will give you the best chance to make the NCAA tournament. HDI will break down our shot efficiency and that of our opponents. This gives us data showing which is our best defensive lineup and offensive lineup and our best rebounding lineup. Hurley continues, we don't take what they say as gospel, but we lean on them heavily, and we try to always achieve that mix of analysis and intuition. Gut and feel are still a big part of the game. Wow, so reading that, it's almost like, geez, what decisions do you make? Is this thing just on autopilot? But it's definitely not. It's that last part about the mix being key and how gut and feel are still a big part of the game. You can tell I just recently worked through a Joe Madden episode because I keep mentioning it, but it's serendipitous in this aspect as well because that is a monstrous theme in Joe Madden's book, that theme of analytics versus instinct. And long story short on that, for Joe Madden and other MLB managers like Bruce Bochy, most of them want data. It's great. It can give you an edge, but within reason. It gets to be too much and too stifling at times. You need to have that gut experience and those personal relationships with the players, especially in the baseball playoffs or any playoffs in sports because of the smaller sample size. A crazy aside on Madden, and you should check out that episode if you want to know more about him. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. But in his first managing job with the Devil Race, he actually disavowed his gut and instinct. He thought it was too whimsical and impulsive and that he should stick with data. And this is coming from a guy who grew up sort of old school baseball in the minor leagues and relied heavily on gut and instincts and mentored under guys like that. But as data is taking the forefront here in the early 2000s, Madden sort of disavows his gut, but then he ultimately comes back to it and realizes, actually, this is pretty valuable. He comes to define it as thinking in advance and deep-rooted knowledge that surfaces as instinct. Those are quotes from his book. Madden and Tom Verducci, who co-authors that book with Madden, say, gut is not the enemy of information. It is the necessary colleague in good decision-making. Again, that book is The Book of Joe by Joe Madden and Tom Verducci. You should check that out if you're interested in learning more. But anyway, back to Hurley and Uconn. They're using HDI and Hurley's own instincts to add more players from the transfer portal as well to complement that solid group of returning players. And they had guys that season like Joey Calcaterra, who he calls Joey California, from San Diego, Hassan Diarra of Texas A&M, and Tristan Newton of East Carolina. And it all works. Not so spoiler alert, they go on and win the title. They beat San Diego State in that 22-23 season to become national champions. But let's just recap what Coach Hurley does at this pivotal time. He looks in the mirror, realizes he needs to change, studies his you-know-what off, learning new offenses, and uses creativity and innovation and some independent thinking. He opens his mind to different personality types, starts recruiting character rather than just pure talent, uses the resources at hand that help him like HD Intelligence, but uses them wisely and with prudence. And that's what winning DNA looks like this day and age in college basketball. And again, they won that year and they won the year after that. And he's got them playing at a similar caliber this year. They might win it again. Let's transition to talk about the stuff that really, really matters over the span of a person's life and in the long run. And that's family. And I want to talk about Hurley's wife and his son. He has two sons, but one because he played for him is a little more featured in this book than the other. But let's start with Andrea Hurley. So as I mentioned in the intro, wild Irish guys like he and I, they need an Andrea Hurley. They need a Corey Owens. Tough women that are smart, really street smart, have great people reading instincts, know how to call you out when you need to be called out. They're great mothers and know how to hold a family together. So let's talk about Andrea Hurley here. She is basically the thing and the person that holds the family together through some really tough moments, especially in his high school coaching days, but throughout his days at Wagner and Rhode Island as well. She shows superhuman strength doing that. Let's back up and talk a little bit about how they met. You know, it's funny because another parallel here that hits home for me with Hurley is that we both ended up with younger spouses. My wife is 7 years younger than me, and I believe Andrea Hurley's 5 years younger than Dan Hurley. And he addresses this in the book. He says he met his wife Andrea at a bar right off the Seton Hall campus. And he says, I was enamored right away, and I was not the least bit discouraged that she was a freshman, whereas I was a fifth-year senior. She was super mature. I was permanently immature. We're basically equals, I thought. I kid you not, that could have been the exact script of my thoughts when I met my wife and was dating my wife as well. I still tell people to this day that our age difference helps equalize us because of my immaturity, and there's a lot of truth in that. For me, as I'm sure there is for Coach Hurley. Going back even earlier to before they even met, there's a really cool moment that I think just shows the great character of Andrea Hurley and how she's sort of perfect for Dan and how she in some ways must be meant for him. Growing up, her dad was a big sports fan and actually a big fan of Bob Sr. and his St. Anthony's team, which must have made it easy for Dan Hurley to get in good with the old man, so to speak. But Andrea Hurley herself could have cared less about sports. She only went to one game her freshman year at Seton Hall, and it was to go with her family who was also going. And that happened to be Danny's last game as a super senior. And they played Ray Allen's Uconn team, and he worked them over. And the Seton Hall crowd started in on Danny, who I don't think had a great game. But it says in the book that Andrea, who again had never met Danny at this point, she turned to her mother in sadness and said, "This is why I hate sports. The kid's doing the best he can, and they're being mean to him." She chirped back at a few of the fans. "Why do you even bother coming to the game if you're just going to yell at this kid?" she told them. "You think he wants to do bad? He's not a professional." So God seemed to be at work there. And then about 4 weeks later, Danny met her, but she was standing up to him against the Seton Hall faithful, even when they didn't even know each other. There's some great stuff in here about their first date as well. His car gets stolen on their first date, and so he can't drive her home, and it totally looks like this ploy he's contrived to have her stay the night or whatever. That wasn't it at all, but she was freaking out, and they didn't have a great first date, but for whatever reason, they ended up having a follow-up date and getting married within the year, I believe. It was fairly quickly after they started dating. And again, same with my wife and I, actually. The first time I tried to reach out around her on Facebook, she actually shot me down. I told her I was moving to Montana and thought we had this little spark and maybe this was going to be my girl. And I still show her this Facebook thread to this day, but she said something like, "Oh, congratulations, have a nice move." Boom. I thought, wow, door shut in my face, misread. But anyway, we ended up moving on from that and getting engaged in 5 months and married in a year or so as well. But as I've alluded to, in the early days of marriage for Dan and Andrea Hurley, she had a lot to put up with. I mean, Danny was coaching high school basketball at St. Benedict's, not making a lot of money, deep in debt. They had this horrible house fire and lost their townhome. And so they had this saga that hung over their head and creates a ton of stress. And on top of that, they had to fight with insurance to get money to replace that townhome. And they weren't getting much. And their insurance adjuster kept telling them, "Oh, just save your receipts. You'll get paid back by insurance." So they rack up all this debt. They never do end up getting much from insurance, so they're left holding the bag with this crippling debt. They've got infant/toddler age kids at home, and that's a whole odyssey in and of itself. And Dan's not helping out much with them. He's drinking and he's smoking, and he's probably not addressing some of the things that he needs to address for his own personal development. So that's really affecting his relationship with Andrea. They've got a ton of stress in their lives. And this is the moment in time that I describe in the intro, where he's driving back from a high school game and he loses his $10 and he's panhandling, trying to get people to give him some money to put gas in his car and to pay his $10 gas bill. He does pay those people back, by the way. He got all their info and sent them money. I think he had to get a few bucks from 3 different people. So, not exactly a high of his life. He says of that night, "When I finally got home that night, things were tense. Andrea and I sat together feeling the weight of our situation, broke as hell, buried in debt, married too young, parents too young. By itself, each of these things ends countless marriages every day. Combined, they're the perfect recipe for divorce. Andrea was Jersey City tough. She could put up with anything but this." And he continues, "And no one on earth could put up with my schedule and my mood swings. I was working all the time, never home, never available. I didn't pitch in and make a meal or go to a doctor's appointment. It reached the point she couldn't even stand the sight of me. I smelled like cigarette smoke and failure." She actually tells him years later that she did go consult a divorce attorney, but as we covered in the intro, he told her they didn't have enough money to get divorced and to give it 6 more months, which proved to be a blessing in disguise, that they just bought a little more time. And that's so often the case, right? You think you can't go another day, but you find some way to get a little more space, a little more runway, and that allows these critical moments for something to happen, for something to budge, to make the difference, and to allow you to move upward and onward. So if you're out there in a dark chapter in your marriage or life, hang in there. This too shall pass is a phrase to always remember for any hardship in life. There's no permanence to anything. And that's very hard to believe in the moment, but it is true. So many of us have been there in different ways, and certainly Dan and Andrea Hurley have, and are at that place in this moment of their story, but they survive slowly. Again, no one wants crawling out of pain to be a slow process, but it is a lot of times. Hang in there, lean on faith, family, friends. But moving past all these really hard days, they continue to grow. He continues his upward mobility and coaching. All this stuff forges them and makes them really strong. And Andrea, she becomes even more of his rock. And to that end, I love the parts he shares in here of how she checks him in only the ways a Jersey girl can, or maybe in the ways only a wife can. Hurley shares in the book in his first year, he got into a shouting match with a rival at Providence, Ed Cooley. I believe this was when Hurley was at Wagner. And he says, I felt embarrassed. Andrea felt mortified. She pulled me to one side and gave me a stern lecture. You're melting down out there right now, buddy. You look ridiculous. The way you're screaming and spitting and yelling at these other grown men, you're taking your anger out on the coaches. Buddy says she spoke the truth. And then down the road, Hurley also shares at Rhode Island. He says, I couldn't afford to keep doing the same thing, being the same kind of a-hole again and again. Andrew would say, everyone's watching you now. You need to get your stuff together. Stronger word for stuff there, but I don't want to get flagged for explicit language here, but you get the point. This is a Jersey girl we're talking about here. And then again at Uconn, when his team lays an egg in the Maui Invitational, fairly recently in 2024, this is after their second national championship season and that preseason Maui tournament, and they were picked to win it, but they lose all their games. They just totally laid an egg, and Hurley was really upset about the officiating against them in that tournament, and at one point, amongst other tirades in that tournament, he gets really animated, more than he usually does, and he's crawling on all fours, laying on his back, just throwing a grown man tantrum out there. And again, Andrea Hurley comes in to put him in his place. She says, you crossed the line. It's not passion, Dan, it's psycho. You've been coaching so angry and so mad for so long, you've lost perspective. You got to get a grip on yourself because you're out of control. So anyway, God bless this little spitfire from Jersey City or New Jersey. And as usually is the case that you see with some of these guys in the limelight of their profession, a ton of the credit goes to the wife. In this case, Andrea Hurley's strength and goodness and her clear head and just her toughness keep him from going too far off the deep end and keep their family together, which is the bedrock of society and makes a massive, massive difference. So huge props to Andrea Hurley here. Hurley, in the closing chapter of this book, says it best about his wife. My wife Andrea is my coach, my rock. When I'm overworked or pressing too hard, she reels me in. Tells me I need to go home at 5 p.m., tells me I need to take a Sunday off. We're going to church. We're going to take a hike together. We're going to have lunch at my favorite Mexican place, Salulitas, with the margaritas and the queso. Andrea's my point guard. Every play runs through her. So really healthy coping skills from those two at this point in their marriage, and great spousal partnership from Andrea. So again, tip of the cap to you, Andrea. Staying on this topic of the importance of family, I want to stay there but highlight his relationship with his son, Andrew Hurley. Andrew joined Uconn as a walk-on from the 2020 to 2024 seasons, and you can tell Dan Hurley loves this. He loves having his son there. He says in the book that he could have played low Division I, but he chose the walk-on life at Uconn, and Coach Hurley told him he's going to treat him like everybody else. But inside, Coach Hurley was really thrilled that he got to do this with his son. He says in the book, one recruit was a player like none I have ever coached, and I was more excited to hear that he wanted to play for me than any recruit I've ever signed. His name was Andrew Hurley. So that's awesome. For any of you fathers out there, I mean, what a dream to be able to coach your son at this level or have him be a part of the program like that. And now Andrew continues to be part of the program. He's a graduate assistant on the team and on the staff there with Hurley post his playing days. But another cool thing to highlight about his relationship with Andrew was actually the impact it had on the team. It was really good for the whole family atmosphere and culture of the Uconn basketball team. Not that that's how Coach Hurley was intentionally designing it, but it was a great byproduct of loving your family and loving your kid and having him hang around, but also treating him the same as everyone else. Coach Hurley says, I ripped him. I jumped him in front of the other guys if he didn't close out on defense or didn't get over a screen, or if he cut the wrong way on offense. I wanted him to have the same experience as the scholarship players, and I wanted them to see there was no difference. Coach Hurley says, it helped his status in the locker room. It made him one of the guys, but also over time, it also made him a tremendous asset for me. Andrew was able to become my spokesperson in the locker room, my ambassador to those kids. He humanized me, explained me, translated me. He communicated things to kids when I wasn't around. Let them know how much I really cared about them, how much I believed in them. Andrew got me closer to the team than I ever could have gotten on my own. His contributions were invisible at times, but invaluable. So I think that's just a great quote there from Hurley, and really cool how this is just a happy accident of him loving his son and wanting to be around him. And for Andrew's part, for signing up with zero entitlement, other than, getting a roster spot on Uconn, but no entitlement from the standpoint of how he was treated. So good for both of them. Let's bring this episode home here, and I think a perfect way to do that is to talk about his last chapter of this book, his And One chapter. And this chapter has so many good things. It's like he cuts right to the bone of some of the things you need to take away from him and from his book. It's mostly non-basketball stuff. Again, so much of this section hit home for me, how he identifies as a late bloomer, how some of his fumbles athletically or in life when he had bad mental health still cause him a lot of pain or to cringe about and can hurt, but also how his peaks came later and his growth came later and that his best days came later. And I just really admire how he stands up to that and squares up to that with a sincere and earnest attempt to help others. He says in this chapter, as a society, we tend to celebrate the prodigy. Everyone loves a Mozart, a Tiger, but late bloomers need love too. Those who peak late, they need a poster boy. And this is me raising my hand volunteering. I'm 52, and I didn't reach my personal mountaintop until the last few years. I am still so scarred by my failures, my career as a young player. I cringe when I see old TV clips and photos. Bad memories come roaring back. I'd wish I'd known then what I know now. And yet, I guess if I had, then I wouldn't be me. I wouldn't be sitting here. So regret's an empty illusion. And everyone, especially leaders, need to remember that. Great stuff there from Coach Hurley. I really feel him when he says that everyone, leaders especially, need to remember that. I think what he's saying here is there's this segment of personnel that are like him, that are like me, and that coaches and teachers, etc., largely miss. And I think we all need to be better about identifying those who are afflicted in this way, who are struggling with performance anxiety or mental health, and maybe work a little harder to peel back the layers with these kids and help them out. They need a different kind of coaching, a little extra TLC on the mental side. And the last thing they need is people cutting bait with them. So to me, Coach Hurley's doing some pioneering work in this book in that regard and with his life. He says in this section, it's hugely important to me to help people with their emotional and mental health work. That part of my journey still feels so recent, so naturally I emphasize it with my kids. Emotional and mental health, I tell everybody, needs to be at the forefront of everything you do. You need to practice both daily, just like shooting and defense. So again, Joe Madden, fresh for me because I just did that episode, but a growing number of other coaches as well would say the same thing. You need to work with a mental skills coach, just like you would a hitting coach or a shooting coach or a conditioning coach. Hurley shares in this section as well that among things, he's trying to be a surrogate father. And this is the goodness I think many people miss about him and what coaching should be all about. Long after that last whistle blows, these guys will have hopefully many more decades in their life, more decades than they ever played basketball or whatever sport they're playing. And those decades are going to encompass their careers, tough bosses, marriages, children, all sorts of complexity to deal with, as all humans encounter and have in those adult years. And he's trying to prepare them. He says, I love my players. I love the fact that college basketball allows me to be a central figure in their lives at such a critical time in their development. It's interesting to note as well that he also acknowledges the whole NIL thing going on here and how that's created unbelievable change in a couple of years. And I want to include this because I found it somewhat humorous and insightful. He says in the chapter, I understand that my players need to do just enough social media to make NIL money, but I also don't want celebrity athletes on my team. I don't want talkers, I want ball players. I'm all in on this thing. And when players are tuned out, when I'm taking a bunch of influencers to the Elite Eight, I'm not happy, and that's the day I probably quit for good. A bunch of influencers to the Elite Eight, I love that. To be clear, he's not saying he has that on his team. He says, if it gets to that point, I'm out of here. And hopefully it doesn't, but interesting times, we'll see where it all goes. He also holds himself to that same standard, though, as well. He says, I'm not a celebrity coach. I'll never be a celebrity coach. I don't want to be a celebrity coach. I don't want to be a celebrity anything, actually. I just want to be a pure coach. I'll always be a pure coach. And I think to that end, this is a good place to end. Everyone's trying to navigate this time and this new generation of kids. And Coach Hurley says he gets asked all the time, how do you coach this generation of kids? How do you reach Gen Z? How do you make them lock in and listen up? He has a great quote where he says, I don't care if it's Gen Z, Gen Y, Gen Alpha, or Gen Aniston. I don't care. You make them be accountable, responsible, disciplined, and never allow them to make themselves bigger than the team. But in this section, into responding to that question about how he treats them, he says, it's all so much simpler than that. He says, my answer to how to treat this new generation is the same as always, with love. So much credit to Coach Hurley to evolve into this man that he's evolved to that approaches his program in this way, with love, especially coming from where he came from. Credit to him that he squares up to the ugly, messy side of his and others' humanity and doesn't want kids to go through the mental, emotional struggles alone or to have to hide it like he had to. He took everything about how he grew up and all he went through battling anxiety and mental health, and he's using it to help others. And what better compliment can you pay a guy with what he's done with his life? So thank you, Coach Hurley, for all of that. Truly, for me, doing this podcast and reading this book was therapeutic. I was not expecting to have some of these parallels of the most shameful parts of my life and athletic career and battles with anxiety and depression jump off the page like it did for me. And I certainly wasn't expecting to share some of those, but Coach Hurley really inspired me with how he was sharing, and so it just felt natural to do so. And that's the power of what he's doing. You're a damn good fella for sharing this, for shining light on it. It's so important. And so I thank you, Coach Hurley, and I thank all of you for listening.